Now that we have an AWS provider configured, we can actually start creating AWS resources using that provider. And throughout this course, we will actually create a couple of these AWS resources using Terraform. So before you move on with this tutorial, it's important to understand these AWS resources first. So in this video, we're going to go through and understand what VPC and Subnet resources are on AWS, as well as Internet Gateway resource, security group, and so on. If you already know these resources, then you can skip this video and go to the next one. Now, whenever you create an account, in each region, you will have something called a VPC. So VPC actually stands for Virtual Private Cloud. So if you go through the services here, all services list, in the networking and content delivery part, we have this VPC service. And right now I'm in the Frankfurt region. And here you see I have a VPC, a default one that gets created with some other configuration as well. And if I switch to another region, for example, Europe, Paris, here I also see a VPC. So I haven't created any of this. This is out of the box by default in each region. So VPC in AWS is basically your private network, right? When you create resources, virtual servers, and so on AWS, you obviously don't want other AWS users or other AWS accounts to have access to your resources, right? You want to protect them and you want only you to have access to them. So because of that, you can create this virtual private cloud on AWS infrastructure that only you have access to. And you create this VPC in a specific AWS region. So again, region is basically one of those regions in the list. So for example, in Paris region in EU West 3, I can create as many VPCs as I want. However, region in AWS consists of multiple availability zones. Availability zone, in very simple words, is basically a data center of AWS with all those servers that runs the whole infrastructure. So the virtual machines that you spin up in your AWS will actually run in one of those AZs, because these are the actual physical locations where the servers will run. So VPC will actually span all the availability zones in that specific region. So here you see Paris has 3 zones and VPC actually spans all of these 3 zones. So in each region, basically VPC isolates a space where you are creating your virtual instances, your servers, maybe database instance, some other components from different services, because obviously this is a data center where others also rent virtual servers, create components, so they might actually be running on the same physical machine, same computer, but they will be isolated in private networks with VPCs. And for bigger corporations that have much more complex application setups, they can actually use multiple VPCs and manage multiple of these private networks in different regions. Now, what does this VPC include? Here you see we are in the VPC dashboard and we have a bunch of other stuff in here. It is basically a virtual representation of network infrastructure. When you have servers physically in your company, which was a traditional way of hosting servers and applications before cloud, you have sys administrators that set up, configure, and manage this whole network. They set up the router, they do all the network configuration, configure firewall, and so on. So all of this physical network infrastructure is basically now moved in cloud, and VPC is the representation of this. And the reason why you have this default VPC in each region is that whenever you create an EC2 instance, it has to run inside a VPC, or whatever component you're launching, it has to start inside a VPC. Another thing you see here is subnets. So we have 3 subnets, and subnets are subnetworks. So VPC is the whole private network, and subnets are basically components or subnetworks of the VPC. While VPC spans the whole region, all the availability zones, subnets span individual availability zones. So for each 3 zones, you will have their own subnet. So it's like a private network inside a network. Another interesting thing in the VPC part is that obviously whenever you create a virtual server, it has to get an IP address. And in VPC, you have a range of private or internal IP addresses. And that range is actually also defined by default, and you can even change it. So if I go inside VPC, here you have a range of IP addresses. So whenever you create a new instance, a new EC2 instance, an IP address will be assigned to it from this range. So internal or private IP address is not for internet traffic, but rather for traffic inside the VPC. So when you have multiple servers, multiple components inside the VPC, they need to communicate with each other, right? So you have an instance with web application, another instance with database application, maybe a third one with some other service. They all need to communicate. So private IP address is what allows them to talk to each other. So the IP address range is defined on a VPC level, and then each subnet then gets its own IP address range, the private IP address range, from that total range, right? Gets like a sub range, so to say. And here you see those sub ranges defined. Now, obviously, when we deploy our web application on EC2 instance, we want it to be accessible from internet, right? From outside. And for that, in addition to private IP address, we need to assign it a public IP address. And this is also configured in VPC service. So when we create an EC2 instance, it will get a private IP address from the range of the subnet inside which that instance will start, and it will also get a public IP address. Internal one for internal communication inside the VPC, and a public IP address for accessing it through the browser. For allowing internet connectivity with your VPC, you also have an internet gateway component. So this basically connects VPC to internet, to the outside world, so that you can get traffic inside your VPC to your web servers, for example, and then you can also send traffic outside if you want to download some stuff from internet on your components, etc. Now, obviously, in addition to all of this network configuration, you need to secure your components, right? So for example, you want to control what traffic enters your VPC or what traffic reaches individual instances and components in your VPC or in your subnets, and you want to control what traffic goes out, right? So this is a firewall configuration basically for your VPC and for individual instances. Now you can configure that security control on multiple levels in VPC. And AWS makes it actually pretty flexible and granular of how you can configure all of this stuff, not just security, but the IP address ranges, the route tables, and so on. And that's why you have this pretty big list of things that you can configure. However, in many cases, you will not need some advanced network configuration. Most of the stuff is configured by default, as you see here, because you have these components already created and configured with some default configuration. And in most simple applications, you will not need to do any crazy configurations here. And since this whole network is private and by default closed to the outside world, so no access from internet. Of course, for your web applications, you want to configure some internet access, right? As well as you want to SSH into your servers from your laptop. So you want to configure some kind of external access. And for that, you have components inside that VPC service called network ACLs, which are basically firewalls or firewall rules for subnets. So you can configure this per subnet. And in addition to that, you have security groups, which are, again, firewall rules, but on a virtual machine level. So inside the VPC, we have the subnet, and inside subnets, we're going to have EC2 instances, which are basically the virtual servers. And we can configure firewall rules on that virtual server level using security groups. So you create both of these components on a VPC level, and then you assign the NECLs to individual subnets and assign security groups to individual instances or components inside that VPC.